Being home alone should be comforting, a place of safety, a place of solitude. But what happens when the walls that are meant to protect you start to feel like a trap? Some threats don't knock. Some don't even need to break in, because sometimes they were inside the whole time. Tonight, we bring you terrifying true encounters from people who thought they were alone until they realized they weren't. Footsteps in an empty house, a knock at the door when no one should be there, a shadow moving in the corner of your eye. If you've ever felt watched in your own home, you might not have been imagining it. Before we begin, turn off the lights, make sure your doors are locked. And if you hear something in the other room while watching this, don't check. Just listen. This is the Fear Archives, and these are true stories of home alone horror. There's a moment when you're alone at night, where the silence feels too heavy, where the walls of your own home seem to press in, and you suddenly become aware of just how alone you really are. For Emily, that feeling had started weeks ago. She lived in a quiet rural house, nestled at the end of a long dirt road. It wasn't remote, but it was isolated enough that the nearest neighbor couldn't hear her scream. She was used to the solitude, but lately something had felt off. She couldn't explain it, but the air in the house felt different. A lingering unease settled over her every time she came home from work, as if the house had been occupied in her absence, as if someone had been there. At first, it was just small things. A cabinet door open when she swore she had closed it. Her keys not where she left them. The bathroom door ajar when she always made sure to shut it. They were easy to dismiss. People forget things. People misplace objects. Then one night, something happened that she couldn't ignore. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, a movie still playing in the background. It was late, past midnight. The room was dark except for the bluish glow of the TV screen flickering against the walls. A sound jerked her awake, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against something. She froze, straining her ears. It came from the kitchen. Her heart pounded as she sat up. The house was locked. No one else was supposed to be inside. She reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly stepping toward the darkened doorway that led to the kitchen. The moment she peeked inside, she felt her stomach drop. The fridge door was slightly open, not wide open, just an inch or two, as if someone had just walked away from it. She wasn't sleepwalking. She wasn't crazy. Someone had been in her kitchen. Then she noticed something else. The back door was unlocked. Emily never left it unlocked. Something cold slithered down her spine. Was someone inside the house right now? She backed away, grabbing the nearest heavy object, an old lamp from the side table, and made a decision. She needed to search the house. She moved room by room, flipping on every light, checking every closet, every corner. Nothing. No footprints in the kitchen, no signs of forced entry. Just that eerily ajar fridge door, and the undeniable fact that someone had been there. But who? And more importantly, where were they now? She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she pushed a chair against the door and clutched her phone in her shaking hands, eyes wide open, waiting for something, anything, to move. By morning, she almost convinced herself it was nothing. A faulty door latch. Maybe she had forgotten to lock the door earlier in the day. That's when she noticed something she had never seen before. A small gap in the hallway ceiling. a barely visible square outline, an attic hatch. Emily didn't have an attic. At least she hadn't thought she did. Her breath came shallow as she reached up, hesitating before placing her fingers on the edge of the panel. And then, it shifted, not by her touch. Something had just moved it from the other side. She yanked her hand back, her body going rigid as the hatch settled back into place, as if someone was slowly retreating. Emily's vision blurred with terror. Someone was living above her. She bolted out of the house, hands shaking as she called 911. The operator tried to keep her calm, but Emily couldn't stop staring up at the hatch, half expecting a face to appear. Within 15 minutes, the police arrived, sweeping through the house. They pulled down the attic hatch and climbed up with flashlights. Emily waited outside, heart hammering, breath fogging up in the cold night air. When the officers came back down, their faces were pale. One of them cleared his throat before speaking. "There's a setup up there." A setup? Emily felt sick as she listened to their description. A thin mattress, empty food wrappers, a small pile of clothes, and worst of all, a notebook. They wouldn't let her see it, but she caught a glimpse as they carried it out. Scrawled over the pages in messy, obsessive handwriting were her daily routines, her work schedule, the times she usually showered when she was alone, how often she locked her doors, and at the very bottom of one page, a final chilling note. "She hasn't noticed me yet." Emily's stomach lurched. Hadn't noticed yet? Had he planned to reveal himself? What was he waiting for? The police never found him. The attic led to a crawl space, which led to a ventilation shaft, which led to an unlocked basement door in the empty house next door. Whoever had been watching her had escaped and was still out there. Emily moved out that same week. She never stayed alone for more than a night again. Even now, years later, she still feels watched when she's alone. Still double-checks her doors. Still wakes up thinking she hears something moving just beyond her sight. Because the worst part wasn't that he had been in her house. It was that he had been there for weeks. Just watching, waiting. And she never even knew. Being alone in your own home should be safe. But what if you're never truly alone? Let us know in the comments. What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you while home alone? And if you hear something tonight, don't check. Just leave. It started as an ordinary morning. The sun had barely risen, casting long golden rays across Mark's backyard. The morning air was crisp, the scent of damp earth lingering after a night of light rain. He stood on his back porch, sipping his coffee, enjoying the silence. That's when he saw it. A figure. At first, just a shadow moving between the trees in the distance. Then, before his mind could fully process what he was looking at, it charged toward the house. Mark's breath hitched as the shape moved with unnatural speed, stumbling slightly as it emerged from the woods. It was a man, barefoot, wearing tattered clothes, his face thin, wild-eyed, desperate. His movements were jerky, erratic, like an animal that had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, it had. Mark's body reacted before his mind did. His coffee mug clattered to the ground as he bolted inside, heart hammering. He locked the door behind him, then ran to the front door, securing every entrance. The house was locked down, but something about this felt wrong. Something worse than just an attempted break-in. And then, the basement door creaked. Mark turned slowly. The sound was subtle, just a gentle shift of wood. But it came from inside, from the basement. His pulse thundered in his ears as he took a step closer, barely breathing. He stared at the basement door, now slightly ajar, a dark void beyond the threshold. Something deep inside him screamed not to go down there. But before he could move, he heard it. A whisper. It came from below. Just 2 words. "He's back." The voice was hoarse, dry, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. Mark staggered back. The man outside had already been inside. He hadn't just broken in. He had been living in Mark's basement. Everything rushed back at once. The small things he had brushed off over the past few weeks. The faint footsteps he chalked up to the house settling. The odd smell wafting through the vents. The cold air creeping from under the basement door despite the heat being on. The missing food. Snacks he assumed he had forgotten eating. His dog growling at the basement stairs late at night. He had convinced himself it was all in his head. Now there was no denying it. Someone had been hiding in his house, watching him, waiting. And when he went to sleep at night, he hadn't been alone. Mark's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone, fingers fumbling to dial 911. Then, bang! The basement door slammed shut. Mark froze. Then, footsteps rushing up the stairs, his body kicked into pure survival mode. He turned and ran, sprinting for the front door just as something collided with it from the other side. The man from the woods, slamming himself against the door. The house was no longer safe. One intruder upstairs, another outside. He was trapped. He bolted toward the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife he could find. His lungs burned, his mind screaming for a way out. The front door rattled violently, the wood splintering. Then, silence. Mark's heart pounded. Footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate. He spun, knife raised. But the basement door was open, and the steps were coming up. A loud crack as the front door burst open. The intruder from the woods rushed inside, but his face twisted in confusion. He wasn't looking at Mark. He was staring at the basement stairs. Mark turned just in time to see a thin, filthy man stepping out of the shadows. His face gaunt, eyes hollow, his skin stretched over sharp cheekbones. But the most terrifying part? The man didn't look angry. He looked relieved. He pointed at the other intruder. "You're not supposed to be here," he rasped. Mark didn't wait to find out what happened next. He grabbed his keys, barreled past them both, and threw himself into his car. As he peeled out of the driveway, he risked one last look at his house. The 2 men were standing face to face, unmoving. And just before he turned the corner, the basement intruder smiled. The police found no one in the house when they arrived. But in the basement, they found evidence that someone had been living there for weeks. A pile of dirty blankets, stacks of empty food containers, scraps of paper with strange, unreadable notes, and a single photograph, a picture of Mark's living room, taken from inside the house. To this day, he doesn't know who either of those men were, or why one of them had been watching him from beneath his own feet. You might think you're alone in your house, but are you? Let us know in the comments. Have you ever had something terrifying happen while home alone? And if you hear a noise from your basement tonight, maybe don't check. The knock was so soft that at first, Ethan wasn't sure if he had imagined it. It was late, nearly midnight, and he was alone in the house. His parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving him in charge of their quiet suburban home. Another knock. More urgent this time. Ethan set his phone down and made his way toward the door. He hesitated for a moment, peering through the peephole. Nothing. But then, a voice. "Please, help me." It was weak, barely a whisper. A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the lock. His parents had always warned him, never open the door for strangers. But what if someone was hurt? What if someone needed help? Against every instinct screaming, "Don't do it," Ethan unlocked the door, just a crack, and peered outside. That's when the stranger shoved his way in. Ethan stumbled backward as the man forced himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The guy looked disheveled, breathing hard, eyes darting wildly around the house. His clothes were filthy, his skin pale and damp with sweat. He didn't look homeless, just out of place. The air felt different now, heavy, wrong. Ethan's voice came out unsteady. Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He was listening, his head tilted as if trying to hear something beyond the walls. Then he muttered, "They're coming. They're coming for me." Ethan's stomach dropped. "They? Who's coming?" The man's wild eyes locked onto Ethan's. "You have to hide me." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He needed to get this guy out. "Listen, I think you should go," he said carefully, taking a step back. "I can call someone to help you." The man's head snapped toward him. "No calls." His voice was sharper now, commanding. Ethan's breath hitched. "But I said no calls." The air seemed to thicken. The man's breathing slowed and a twisted smile spread across his face. He took a step closer, forcing Ethan backward into the dimly lit living room. Something shifted in the atmosphere. Ethan suddenly realized the guy wasn't scared. He wasn't running from something. He was stalling. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as he glanced toward the door. Could he make it? As if reading his mind, the man took another step closer, his presence filling the room. His fingers twitched at his sides. Then, a sound from outside. A faint scraping noise like someone dragging something against the window. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned his head just slightly, just enough to see the glass pane beside the door. And that's when he saw it. A figure. Tall. Motionless. Standing just outside the window. Ethan's lungs seized. There were two of them. The man's lips curled into a grin. "They're here." Ethan's entire body went numb. "They?" His voice barely worked. The man took a deep breath like he was savoring the moment. "You let me in." His voice was too calm now, too knowing. "Now you have to let them in too." Ethan's knees nearly buckled. Outside, more figures appeared. They moved in slowly, emerging from the darkness like shadows peeling away from the night. No faces, no features. Just dark, hulking silhouettes pressing against the windows, waiting. The man turned toward the door. He reached for the lock. Ethan's paralysis broke. He ran. Ethan tore through the house, his legs carrying him toward the back door. He slammed it open, sprinting into the cold night. Behind him, the front door creaked open. Ethan didn't turn back. He didn't want to see what was stepping inside. He reached his neighbor's house in seconds, banging on the door like a madman. The porch light snapped on, and Mr. Holloway, an ex-cop, opened the door with a loaded shotgun in hand. Ethan barely managed. "Someone's in my house," before Mr. Holloway was calling the police. Ethan turned one last time. The front door of his house was wide open, the living room dark, empty. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house. No sign of the man. No signs that anyone had ever been there. No footprints, no evidence. Nothing. But something was missing. The front door lock. It had been ripped out, as if someone had forced their way inside. Or like it had never existed at all. Ethan never slept in that house again. And to this day, when he thinks back to that night, only one thing truly haunts him. If he hadn't opened the door, would they still have gotten in anyway? Sometimes the worst mistake you can make is answering the knock at your door. Have you ever been home alone when something felt off? Let us know in the comments. And next time you hear a knock late at night, don't answer. The first knock was so soft that Lena barely heard it over the sound of the late-night movie playing on her TV. She glanced at the clock, just past midnight. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't expecting anyone. Another knock, slightly louder this time. Lena's apartment was on the outskirts of town, tucked between a row of older, dimly lit buildings. She had always liked the solitude, until now. No one should be knocking at her door this late. Slowly, she crept toward the peephole, her heart already pounding. Outside, standing just beyond the dim porch light, was a man she didn't recognize. He wasn't old or ragged, just off. His expression was blank, his clothes slightly wrinkled, as if he had been wearing them for too long. Then he spoke. "Hey, my car broke down. I just need to use your phone." His voice was flat, unnatural. Lena didn't move. She had her phone in her hand, but something about him, his stillness, the way his body didn't shift like a normal nervous person would, made every instinct in her body scream not to open the door. Instead, she called through the wood, "I can call a tow service for you." A pause, then a smile. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it in his voice. "No need for that," he said. "Just let me in, and I'll make the call myself." The hairs on her arms stood up. Lena took a slow step back. There was no reason for him to insist on coming inside. None. "I can't do that," she said firmly. "I can call for you." A longer pause. Then, in the same calm, unsettling voice, he said, "Well, that's a shame." Her stomach plummeted. Something about the way he said it terrified her, like he knew something she didn't. Then, he stepped out of view. Her breath caught. Where did he go? The peephole showed nothing, just darkness. Then, she heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, moving around the side of the house. Lena's body finally snapped into action. She turned off all the lights. Her fingers trembled as she locked the deadbolt and grabbed her phone, dialing 911. The operator answered and she whispered, "Someone is trying to get into my house." The voice on the other end remained calm, asking for her address and telling her help was on the way. But then, a metallic sound from the back of the house. Lena froze. The back door handle was jiggling. Someone was testing it. A sharp click. Her stomach dropped. He had a key. Lena ran to the back door just as she heard the unmistakable scraping of metal against wood. She barely had time to react before she saw it. The tip of a crowbar wedged between the door and the frame, trying to pry it open. Panic surged through her veins. "Police are on their way," she shouted, hoping he would hear. For the first time, the noises stopped. The silence was worse. Her breath was shallow, her ears straining. Then, footsteps, moving away. The sound of something dropping onto the pavement outside. Then nothing. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. Lena's hands were still shaking when she explained everything to the officer. They searched the yard with flashlights, and that's when they found it. The crowbar. It had been left behind, tossed near the back steps as if he had abandoned his plan at the last second. "Are you sure you didn't recognize him?" the officer asked. Lena nodded. Then he told her something that made her feel sick. The man hadn't come from a broken-down car. There were no cars outside, no signs of anyone leaving on foot. It was like he had vanished. Or worse, like he had never needed a car in the first place. For weeks, Lena couldn't sleep. She double-checked her locks, installed security cameras, and even stayed at a friend's house for a while. But one question haunted her more than anything. If she hadn't locked the door in time, would the police have found more than just a crowbar? Sometimes danger doesn't knock loudly, it whispers. Have you ever had a stranger come to your door late at night? Let us know in the comments. And if it ever happens again, whatever you do, don't open it. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Claire heard it, a faint clinking sound coming from the kitchen. Half asleep, she barely reacted. It was probably her cat, Loki, knocking something over. He had a habit of jumping onto the counters at night, exploring while she slept. She sighed, pulling the blankets tighter around her. Then, another noise, a soft creak like a cabinet being opened. She furrowed her brows, but exhaustion weighed her down. "Loki, you little troublemaker," she murmured, turning over and letting sleep take her again. She didn't know it then, but she was not alone. The next morning, Claire yawned and stretched, groggy from a restless night. As she got up, her gaze landed on Loki, curled up at the foot of her bed. Wait, if Loki was in her room all night, who was in the kitchen? Her stomach dropped. She stepped out into the hallway, her body suddenly hyper-aware of her surroundings. The house was quiet, but something felt off. When she reached the kitchen, her blood turned ice cold. The window was open, not just unlocked, wide open. A chair was slightly pulled back from the table, and a single kitchen drawer was half open, as if someone had been looking for something. Claire froze. She knew with absolute certainty that she had locked that window before going to bed. Panic swelled in her chest. Was someone still inside? She grabbed a knife from the counter and moved cautiously through her home, checking every room. The closets, the bathroom, under the bed. Nothing. But that didn't mean no one had been there. By the time she reached her front door, she was already dialing 911. When the police arrived, they checked the house but found no one. That's when Claire remembered her security cameras. She had a small motion-activated camera near the front of the house, facing the street. If someone had entered or left, it might have caught them. She pulled up the footage on her phone, her hands shaking as she scrolled to the night before, and then she stopped breathing. The grainy footage showed a man crouched outside her kitchen window just after 1:45 a.m. For a long time, he didn't move. He just watched. Then, slowly, methodically, he slid the window open and climbed inside. Claire's entire body went numb. She fast-forwarded. The man walked through her kitchen, rummaging through drawers. Then, he stood still, listening. He turned his head toward the hallway, toward her bedroom. Then, in a moment so horrifying it made her stomach lurch, he took one slow step in her direction, and then another. Claire's breath hitched as she watched the footage of the man moving down the hall, toward her room. Her hands shook violently as she skipped ahead. The man never entered her bedroom. Instead, he stood outside her door for several minutes, just listening. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back to the kitchen, and left, as if he had changed his mind, as if he had been debating something, as if he had been watching her sleep and considering what to do next. Claire's head spun as the police took the footage and promised to investigate, but nothing was stolen. Nothing was out of place. Whoever he was, he hadn't come for money. He had come for her, and he had stood there just feet away while she slept. She never felt safe in that house again, and to this day she can't stop wondering, what made him change his mind? And what if he comes back? Sometimes the scariest intruders aren't the ones that break in. They're the ones who get inside and leave without a trace. Have you ever woken up to something feeling wrong in your house? Let us know in the comments, and always, always check your security footage. The first night in the cabin had been peaceful. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across the rustic wooden walls. Erin curled up in an oversized chair, letting the silence settle over her. She had spent summers here as a kid, but this was the first time she had come alone. She had driven up that afternoon, eager for a weekend away from city life. No notifications, no work emails, no distractions. Just her, the trees, and the quiet. Or so she thought. Because at exactly 2:13 a.m., the footsteps began. It was faint at first. A soft creak of the wooden porch, like something had shifted its weight outside. Erin's eyes snapped open. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room bathed in shadows. The only sound was the faint whisper of wind through the trees. Had she imagined it? Then, another creak. Her breath caught in her throat. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer, or a raccoon scavenging near the cabin. But something felt wrong. The silence that followed was too perfect, like something waiting. She grabbed her flashlight and walked cautiously to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the woods stretched into blackness. The moon cast pale streaks through the pines, but the porch itself was empty. No movement, no signs of life. Still, a deep unease settled in her stomach. She double-checked the locks, threw another log on the fire, and forced herself to go back to sleep. But for the first time since arriving, she felt watched. The second night, the knocking began. 3 soft taps against the cabin door. Erin's eyes flew open. She lay still, her pulse hammering in her ears. Was it the wind, a loose branch? Then 3 more knocks. Slow, deliberate, closer this time. Erin swallowed hard. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor. No one should be out here. She slid out of bed, heart pounding, creeping toward the front door. Holding her breath, she peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she noticed it. A single muddy footprint on the wooden porch. It was barefoot. She locked the door immediately. And for the first time in years, she slept with the lights on. By the 3rd night, Erin wanted to leave. Something was wrong here. She had spent the whole day searching the property. No tracks, no signs of trespassers. But the unease wouldn't leave. So she pushed furniture against the door that night. Just in case. The woods outside were silent, not even the usual chirping of crickets. Then, something tapped against her bedroom window. Erin's blood froze. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. Another tap. And then she saw them. Handprints. 2 muddy handprints, smudged onto the outside of the glass. They were too high up for an animal, too perfectly placed to be a trick of the weather, and they hadn't been there before she went to bed. Erin didn't wait. She grabbed her bag, shoved on her boots, and bolted out the front door, not looking back. Her car's headlights sliced through the darkness as she sped down the dirt road, gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She didn't stop driving until she reached cell service. Calling her brother, she explained everything: the noises, the knocking, the footprints. He agreed to drive up and check the cabin for her the next morning. But when he arrived, he found something worse. The handprints were still on the window, but beneath them, drawn into the dirt, was a message. "See you next time." Erin never returned alone again, and to this day, she wonders. If she had stayed just one more night, would she have woken up to something inside the cabin? Or worse, would she have woken up at all? Some doors should never be opened, some whispers should never be answered, and some silences are watching. These were the true stories of those who thought they were safe at home, until they weren't. If you enjoyed this video, help us grow the Fear Archives by liking, subscribing, and sharing your own terrifying experiences in the comments. And before you go, double-check your locks, close your curtains, and if you hear something tonight, don't assume you're alone. Stay safe, stay aware, and always stay afraid.